The Paranormal Podcast is brought to you by Gaia, the streaming TV service dedicated to exploring the cutting edge of metaphysics, ancient wisdom, and the unexplained. 5,000 years of wisdom on demand. Get your first month for only 99 cents. Visit Gaia.com/Jim. That's Gaia.com/Jim to see what's happening on the largest consciousness media streaming platform in the world. Thanks, Gaia.
This is the Paranormal Podcast with Jim Harold.
Welcome to the Paranormal Podcast. I am Jim Harold and so glad to be with you once again. And today we are in for a real treat because we're going to talk about real magic, ancient wisdom, modern science, and a guide to the secret power of the universe. Now, to folks who don't know the background of that title, that might sound, I guess some people would call it woo-woo and out there. But what if I told you a well-respected scientist is behind that title? Well, one in fact is, I'm talking about Dr. Dean Radin. He's been on the programs before. He is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and distinguished professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Before joining the research staff at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in 2001, he held appointments at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, the University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He is author of or co-author of over 200 technical and popular articles, 36 book chapters, and 4 books, including the award-winning best-selling The Conscious Universe. He's also done Entangled Minds, the award-winning Supernormal, and again, his latest, brand new here in 2018, Real Magic. Dr. Dean Radin, welcome back to the program.
Thanks very much.
My, oh my, where do we begin? Where does a scientist come down saying that there is, in fact, real magic? It seems like almost counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? So I need to explain what I mean by real magic. Well, first of all, make a distinction with fictional magic, like Harry Potter, and illusionary magic, like stage magic, or Harry Houdini. So it's not one of the two Harrys. It's the underlying ideas that give rise to the fiction and to the stage magic. And in particular, if you look at the esoteric traditions, both Eastern style and Western style esoteric traditions, it goes back starting with shamanism, roughly 10,000, maybe 15,000 years ago. And then it goes through names that many of your listeners probably recognize, things like Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, Gnosticism, the Kabbalah, and so on. These are all ancient cosmologies, ways of thinking about the world. In more modern times, we know about the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians and Theosophy. And then very recently, in fact, still contemporary, we have Mind Science Church and New Thought, Christian Science, and the whole book genre of affirmations and law of attraction. It's all part of this 10 or 15,000 year thread of a way of thinking about the nature of reality. And so the claim that I'm making in this book on real magic is that if you look at all of those traditions, these Eastern and Western esoteric traditions, they basically come down to a statement that could be said in 3 words, and that is that consciousness is fundamental. And by that, they meant that consciousness is more fundamental than the physical world. So that's quite dramatically different than the scientific worldview, which has developed for about the last 400 years. And in the scientific worldview, it can be said in one sentence. It's that everything is made out of matter, including mind. Whereas the esoteric traditions was the exact opposite. Everything is made out of mind except matter. Oh, including matter, I mean. So how do we reconcile these two directions of thinking about the nature of reality? That's been a problem that philosophers have been tackling for a long time without much resolution. But there is a problem. And the problem is that when you start looking at the actual practice of magic, of real magic, it turns out that science has been studying these kinds of phenomena for about 150 years. And we now have very high confidence that some of that actually does exist using the best tools of science that we have. So what do? We know that some real magic exists, but the worldview from a magical perspective is very different than the scientific worldview. That puzzle was what motivated me to write this book. And so that's why a scientist is writing a book, because we're dealing with real facts and we have to fit it in somehow into the rest of our scientific understanding of reality.
Now, here's what I'm anxious to ask you, because we will have many guests on the show, and many of them, I would guess, have probably not had many science courses beyond something you might find at an elementary level in college, undergraduate, for example. And then they'll start talking at great length about quantum physics, which I'm not even sure the physicists understand it. So, when a skeptic says something, then they'll say, but quantum physics. So I want to get it from a scientist. The idea here, does quantum physics and the newer science play a role in kind of affirming the idea of real magic?
I believe it does. It certainly doesn't go as far as saying that quantum physics explains consciousness or explains magic. But rather, the way I think of it is that the major difference between classical physics, Newtonian-style physics, which was very popular up until about the beginning of 1900, the difference between classical physics and quantum physics is that in quantum physics, you can no longer ignore the process of measurement or observation, because it's well known that by measuring a system at the quantum scale, like a photon or electron or some other elementary particle, that the act of measuring it changes its behavior in a dramatic way, not even a subtle way. And this has given rise to a puzzle that no one actually understands yet. But what's worth pointing out is that most of the founders of quantum mechanics were deeply concerned about this change in physics, changing from the assumptions in classical physics where your observation of a system didn't affect it at all, to a new kind of physics which was much more accurate than classical physics, in which observation does matter. So that opens the door just a crack for consciousness to play a role in some way in the nature of physics. And if you look then at classical physics and then the evolution into quantum physics, the direction that we're moving from a physical perspective is in the direction, I would say, of consciousness becoming more important. And that is in alignment with what the esoteric traditions say. And in fact, it's necessary if we try to imagine a way to understand how magic can actually work. So that would be how I would respond to the relationship between a modern understanding of physics and an older version of physics.
One thing that fascinates me is the idea of the law of attraction, and it appeals to me on one level, but but on another level, I have a problem with it. If you're a lot of times it's kind of a prosperity message. So, if you think hard enough and you have a great enough intention to get that Mercedes in the driveway, it will somehow mysteriously appeal. Now, to me, that seems a little silly. On the other hand, I think in terms of tendencies, and if you work hard and you persevere at whatever your career is, and you also put out a positive thought and intention and kind of meld that all together in a recipe, I think you can be more likely to get that Mercedes. What does the research show, and how do you feel about things like The Secret and the law of attraction and intention?
Well, I think the way you put it is actually accurate. That we know from laboratory studies that your intention does actually push the physical world around to a small extent, a very small extent, but that it happens at all is already a major miracle. So I think what is happening then with the law of attraction is that a large chunk of it is psychological orienting. You prime yourself to look for opportunities that will push in the direction of your intention. And of course, if our attention is distracted all the time, or we don't know what our goal is, then you're not likely to achieve much. But if you have a very clear goal, very strong intention to keep working at that goal, the combination of the psychological priming that happens combined with a very small but real tweaking of probabilities in the world, then the likelihood of the Mercedes showing up is much, much higher than if you were to just casually sort of whine about the fact that you didn't have a Mercedes. You have to work at it too. So from the laboratory perspective, we've done studies looking at the role of intention in affecting everything from photons to bacteria to cell cultures to small animal behavior to human physiology to electronic circuits, you name it, a very wide range of targets. And the overall evidence for this wide range of targets is that intention does matter, even under conditions that are highly controlled so that there's no ordinary way that somebody's intention could interact with the system. So it's a real thing. That's why I'm talking about this in terms of real magic. And even something that might not seem like it involves an intentional effect, something like telepathy, a mind-to-mind connection, that can be interpreted as having one person's mind influence on others. That's why the other person gets a hit, or some kind of a telepathic hit. So I would say then that the books like The Secret are valuable in exposing people to esoteric ideas, but the promises made within such books are usually way beyond what is realistically can be expected. There are always going to be some anecdotes which are astonishing, where people use the law of attraction to do something big, and it happens. But the more realistic question is, what happens to people in general? And so the keys are strong intention, very clear goals, and working at it, not just passively expecting something to show up.
Now, I'll give you an example on the flip side. There's some people who feel they have a negative effect on technology. If they walk into a room and interact with a computer, they will have some kind of problem with it, or a copying machine, or whatever it might be. Is there any research to show something like that could be real as well?
Yeah, there is. I actually did a study some years ago using electronic chips that are used in things like computers and machinery and so on, to see if that kind of integrated circuit would be susceptible to intentional influence. And it was. Again, to a very small extent. Most electronics that are made today have all kinds of error-correcting machinery inside of it. Virtually everything that you use electronically is always correcting itself all the time, because small mistakes and errors can pop up. So the reason why most computers are not responding to our intentions or thoughts most of the time is because they're constantly correcting themselves. But that said, when you run an experiment where you're specifically trying to influence something and you're monitoring just that part, you can see that there are small influences that are going on. The other thing is that as you're mentioning, on the flip side, where things are breaking, electronic equipment is breaking, some of that may have to do with intention, but some of it also has to do with the nature of the person themselves. So one example is that this is now almost 40 years ago. There were studies on why it was that women at the time were in typing pools in industries. And they had newfangled typewriters, which are now kind of old-fashioned. But at the time, they had a lot of electronic parts in it, and they kept finding that these typewriters kept breaking, and they couldn't figure out why. So eventually, someone figured out that Women at the time were wearing stockings that, because of the movement of the legs and the behavior of the fabric and so on, it was building up large static charges. And so the lady would touch the keyboard and send a spark into the system and, of course, break it. So it took a while for them to figure out that this was an electrostatic reason for why the machinery was breaking, and it had to do with the fabric of mostly women at the time that were operating the typewriters. So there are some cases where the individuals from static charges and other aspects of the individual can make machinery fail. What it doesn't explain is why you're coming up to the copy machine and you really, really need the copy right now, and that's the moment it decides to break. So in that case, my suspicion is that you're under a very high motivation moment, high emotion as well, and our conscious intentions are part of what we are doing, but there's an enormous amount of unconscious intention as well. In fact, the majority of what's going on inside our mind is unconscious. And we have self-defeating properties happening constantly. Otherwise, people wouldn't be smoking and drinking so much. So what we may consciously want can be defeated by elements within us that we're not so sure that we want. So if somebody has a lot of anxiety about something that they need to copy, that could override their conscious level need to actually have it copied. So their unconscious basically goes in and blasts the machine in such a way so that you have an excuse that you say, well, I couldn't make the copy. And that's what you really wanted, but you weren't admitting it to yourself.
It's interesting. Also interesting to me is, and it kind of plays into this, I think, it seems as though some people we know in our lives, at least I know it's in my life, and I've heard other people refer to this, some people just seem like they have a dark cloud. You know, they'll have a car accident and then they'll have a health crisis and then they'll have a financial crisis and then their pet will die. It just seems like it's a perpetual series of negative events. On, again, the flip side, you have the people who seem like they have a charmed existence. Everything seems to just fall right into place. And I always wonder about the role of intention and attitude and all of those things in that.
Yeah, it probably plays a role. We know that, at least in terms of psychic talent, that we're dealing with something that looks like a normal curve. So some people are going to be extremely talented just naturally, and others will be effectively psi blind. They never get anything psychic. So for extreme positive or extreme negative luck, we're talking about people who are naturally talented, except that the way that talent is expressed can be positive or negative. It's basically one's attitude and one's look on life. Some people are very positive and others are simply not. And so if you happen to be psychically talented, you can arrange to always be in the wrong place at the wrong time or the right place at the right time.
Our guest is Dr. Dean Radin. We're talking about real magic, and we'll be back right after this. The Paranormal Podcast is brought to you by Gaia, the streaming TV service dedicated to exploring the cutting edge of metaphysics, ancient wisdom, and the unexplained. And keep listening because I'm going to tell you how you can get your first month for only 99 cents. There truly isn't anything else out there like it. Gaia is the solution. If you want to watch streaming videos, streaming programming, in the convenience of your own home, on your phones, on your various devices, you must have Gaia. Because, yeah, there are a ton of streaming services out there, these big ones that have big blockbuster movies and comedies and dramas and those kind of things, and they're great, but they don't have the kind of content you love, the kind of content you hear on this show, and so much more. And the thing about Gaia, you're not tied down. You can watch Gaia on all of your devices. Apple TV, your iPhone, your iPad, your Chromecast, your Android device, your Fire TV, your Roku, your computer. If you're listening to this program, you can watch Gaia. And the thing is that, yes, there is a lot of general video out there on the internet, but I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It's not very good. But with Gaia, professional all the way, high quality all the way. Gaia creates their own original exclusive programming. They curate the best from third parties, and then they bring it all to you in this super accessible package. And they explore the things we're interested in. And each and every week, they send me an update on what's coming up, and I'm always amazed. I said, I gotta watch that. And here's some of what you're missing if you're not tuned into Gaia this week. Beyond Belief with George Norrie, The Keys of Enoch. George's guests are JJ and Desiree Hurtak. Inspired by wisdom from interdimensional beings, doctors JJ and Desiree Hurtak explain how they discovered the keys of Enoch to unlock new insights into the nature of humanity and the fate that we face. Or perhaps you want to check out Open Minds with Regina Meredith. This week, her guest is Jerry Wills. Jerry talks about accessing intuitive healing. He shares some of his secrets to his intuitive healing process and explains how we each can connect with our own healing power and take an active role in our well-being. Or perhaps you want to check out Buzzsaw with Living for Death with Cindy Dale. Cindy has been a guest on our shows. Death is an inevitability which we all must face, and there is a way that we can spiritually prepare for the greatest adventure of our lives. Cindy offers guidance for living in ways that will prepare us to properly transcend the moment of death. And that's just starting things out. You've got David Wilcock with his latest version of wisdom teaching, Shaping the Genetic Expression of Life. And you also have Corey Good and Emery Smith with a new edition of Cosmic Disclosure and so much more on Gaia. So here's how you get it. Go to Gaia.com/Jim. That's Gaia.com/Jim. Now, there I've handpicked some shows on UFOs, haunted places, and Bigfoot that I thought you might like, and you can watch those. You don't have to log in or anything. You can watch them right there at Gaia.com/Jim. And once you've sampled those, there's a little button, and I'm sure that you're going to want more, and you can sign up for only 99 cents for your first month. 99 cents. Do that favor for me. Check it out. I know you'll love it. Go to Gaia.com/Jim. That's Gaia.com/Jim to see what's happening on the largest consciousness media streaming platform in the world. I love it. You'll love it. Thanks, Gaia.
Now back to the Paranormal Podcast with Jim Harold.
We're back on the Paranormal Podcast. I think we're having truly one of the most interesting conversations we've had this year. I hope you're enjoying it. Our guest is Dr. Dean Radin, and we're talking about real magic. Something you've done work on, I know, which is fascinating to me. I mean, I may not phrase it right, but you'll know what I'm talking about. You've done some fascinating work on looking at indications of large world events, like 9/11 and things like that, where we had the ability to see, you would see that something big was going to happen on the world scene, that there were indications of that. And you literally have printouts showing this. I think that work is fascinating. Could you tell people a little bit about that?
What you're referring to is the Global Consciousness Project. This was a project that ran for about 18 years as a formal study. It's now continuing to run, but we're not paying much attention to it anymore because the formal side of the experiment has finished. And what it consisted of was electronic circuits called random number generators, which produce random bits, zeros and ones. And it does it with high efficiency and in a digital way so that they're easy to monitor. These are truly random devices that are based on a certain kind of electronic noise. So it's not like an algorithm, it's true random events. So we had at one time as many as 70 of these random generators in major cities around the world, and would record the data continuously for 18 years. And then when something big happened in the world that attracted a lot of attention, we would mark that as an event of interest, set the length of time that we thought that the event would last, usually a matter of a couple of hours to sometimes 8 hours. And then after setting that, we would go and look at the data, the random data, before, during, and after that event to see if it had deviated from chance. So when a random system deviates from chance, it becomes more ordered. And so that's what we could see statistically.
Sure.
So after 500 events, took a long time to get 500 major world events, the experiment finished, and we were able to do an overall statistical assessment as to did the random generators deviate from chance or not during these 500 events. And the results was odds against chance of 1 trillion to 1 in favor of the hypothesis that, yeah, something happens to the physical world when a large proportion of humanity is paying attention to the same thing at the same time. And so the implication of that is that there's something like a world mind that is interacting with or participating in the nature of physical reality, almost like mind and matter are two sides of the same coin. So you can't separate the two, and they're closely correlated with each other. So during events that attract a lot of attention, it's the mind, you think of the world mind as becoming highly coherent for a short period of time. Everyone's paying attention to the same thing. Well, if the one side of the coin becomes highly coherent, the other side has to follow because it's part of the same system. And so the way that we detect coherence arising in the physical world is by monitoring these random systems, because by definition, they should be random all the time, except they're not so random when minds become highly coherent. So to come back to my book, Real Magic, we developed a new kind of random system that we've been using the last couple of years, where rather than using a random number generator that produces bits, we're actually recording the random noise itself, the noise from the electronic circuit. This allows us to do different kinds of analyses that we couldn't do previously. And in particular, we're using the metaphor from Star Wars of a disturbance in the force as a way of seeing whether something is happening to the physical world during large-scale events. So we've done this a number of times at Burning Man, the big festival in the Nevada desert. But the one I talk about in the book is at the night of the election, of the presidential election in 2016, because that was a good event to look at because there was a lot of people very interested in the outcome. As it drew to the close of the election, it looked like what everyone was predicting was not going to happen. And by about midnight of the day of the election, finally all the news services called the election for the candidate that no one expected was going to win. So it was a perfect kind of experiment or event to use for these random generators, because it meant that there were probably hundreds of millions of people who were shocked, either positively or negatively, but there was a lot of intention and attention at that time. So we had 32 of our new random systems running at the time. They were actually running in a home that was near Skywalker Ranch, which is where a lot of the Star Wars movies were made, out in Marin County in California. We thought that was an appropriate place to look for a disturbance in the force.
Makes sense.
And we had two kinds of analyses. The disturbance in the force we interpreted as something like a ripple or a warp in space-time. And there's one analysis looks at what's called an autocorrelation, which is self-similarity in time. And a random system should show no self-similarity in time at all. But if it does, that's indicating that there's a warp in time. The other analysis is called a mutual information analysis, and it's looking for similarity in outputs of the 32 generators that were near each other, but under ordinary conditions, they should be all acting completely random from each other. But if they don't, it suggests that there's something happening strange in space, and so that analysis was looking for a ripple in space. So we did both analyses and found that within a couple of minutes of midnight, when the election was finally called, there were spikes or deviations in the randomness in both space and time. And we're talking about odds against chance of many millions to one of seeing a change in randomness, not only of the magnitude that we saw, but of happening at that time. So we saw something like a disturbance in the force as the election was being called.
Wow. Wow, so this obviously says that the force, and I hate to keep quoting a movie, but the force is real. I mean, the force is real.
Well, we're not entirely sure what the force means in the Star Wars sense, but at least in terms of a metaphor, something like that does seem to be real. Yeah.
Now, is there other, in the book, you have a chapter about scientific evidence. What's some of the other scientific evidence of the existence of real magic, the best evidence in your mind?
Well, I talk about 6 classes of experiments, all of which have to do with psychic phenomena, all of which have been repeated many times, and all of which have been meta-analyzed. That means that you take the results of many repetitions of the experiment by independent labs, and you can make a statistical assessment as to whether or not the effect being studied has been repeated. So this has been done for studies of telepathy, of studies of intention affecting random number generators on a one-to-one basis, one person, one generator, and also in the collective, like with the Global Consciousness Project. With clairvoyance, typically called remote viewing, but it's basically the same thing, and with precognition, and a couple of other classes of studies. So the primary ways of thinking about psychic phenomena have been repeated many times. We know that they're repeatable independently, and they match all of the requirements of a scientific test. So apropos to this, about 2 weeks ago, at the end of May 2018, a major article was published in a journal called American Psychologist. This is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, which is the primary academic association for psychologists, both clinical and experimental psychologists. So when an article is published in American Psychologist, it means it is bubbled up to the mainstream. The article was talking about the evidence for psychic phenomena, and it presented 10 meta-analyses of different classes of experiments that have been done. And the overall conclusion was these phenomena have been repeated and are shown to exist by the same standards used in any other area of science. So for that to be a major article in a major mainstream journal is showing that regardless of what other scientists may think about it or not, most of them don't actually know the evidence very well, but the evidence is there. It's quite clear that psychic phenomena exist. So what does psychic phenomena have to do with magic? The connection is that when you look at how magic has been practiced throughout the ages, it boils down to 3 different categories. One category is called divination. So the stereotype is someone looking into a crystal ball. Divination means perceiving through space and time. Well, we know now from studies of psychic phenomena that clairvoyance and precognition, which have to do with perceiving through space and time, it exists. So the magical practices of divination is true. That's why I call it part of real magic. The second category of real magic is something I call force of will, which is about law of attraction, about setting your intention, affecting the physical world. We know that's true from studies of random number generators and many other physical systems. And the third category, in the magical sense, is called theurgy, which is talking about communicating with spirits or with deceased entities or maybe non-human entities. And this has been studied within parapsychology in looking at mediumship and channeling and near-death experience and that sort of thing. So of the 3 magical categories, divination and force of will are we have high confidence that those things are real. In terms of theurgy, our level of confidence is not quite as high in terms of how to interpret the evidence. We know, for example, that mediums really can get verifiable information from the deceased or from somewhere. We don't actually know that it's from the deceased. We just know that the information is correct.
Right.
And this is an ongoing problem. We don't actually know that there's survival of consciousness. There's a lot of bits of evidence suggesting that, but it's not as easy to test that idea as it is to test the standard psychic effects.
Well, ironically, I was literally having this discussion with somebody maybe an hour ago, talking about when you look at something like supposed mediums, maybe they are tuning into something, but maybe it's telepathy of the person they're reading, and they themselves may not even realize it. That's just an alternate explanation.
Yeah, and that puzzle has been going on at least for 150 years when people started studying mediumship. That it's very clear that you can conduct a very rigorous triple-blind experiment to show that the information that the medium gets is correct, but we don't know where the information comes from. And it's true. It might be telepathy, it might be precognition, it might be who knows what. It might be a deceased person. But until we have a way of cleanly separating the various interpretations, we just don't know yet.
Now, just your opinion. Now, obviously, the ancients did not have the scientific tools and technology and methods that we have now, but did they have a more healthy relationship or respect with the spiritual, or those who pursued the spiritual? Do you think we lost something along the way in that regard?
I think that's a romantic notion. We like to think that if we were all just a little less driven by technology, that we'd be kinder and gentler with each other. But unfortunately, history shows the complete opposite. The farther back in history you go, the more brutal people are, and it's I think largely because we now live in a place where many people have the luxury of not having to worry about how to get food or shelter. There's still plenty, of course, who do have that problem. But a large number of people in the world now are able to live their entire life and live comfortably. And that's an enormous luxury as compared to the past. So it's true, if you go back even to ancient Greece, that there were some people who had the luxury, the philosophers and the citizens of Rome, say, or of Greece. But most people did not. There were many, many slaves at the time. The medicine was pretty primitive, and most people had a pretty sorry life. So the notion of ancient and spiritual is probably not as kind as we'd like to think it is.
An excellent point. In the book, you talk about Merlin-class magicians. Who are the Merlin-class magicians?
Well, the reason I brought that up is because in the previous chapter is discussing the scientific evidence. Scientific evidence is very clear, but the effects that we see in the laboratory are pretty small. The reason why the effects are small in the laboratory is because we're asking a subject to come in the lab and to perform a miracle on demand under conditions that we are monitoring. So it's not easy to do that. Even for talented people, maybe they need to spend more time, or we're in a lab situation. We have a limited amount of time to see a miracle. So the effects that we see are relatively small. So somebody can then say, well, who cares? Maybe the stuff is real, but if it's so weak, then I can't use it. Why would I care about it? So I then talked about three individuals in history who were extremely powerful in terms of what they were able to do, or at least what we were able to document that they could do. One of them was Saint Joseph of Cupertino. Saint Joseph was, among many other things, able to levitate, and he was promoted, let's say, into becoming a saint based on the church's evaluation of the stories about him. So when the church elevates somebody to sainthood, they go through a process where the so-called devil's advocate is assigned to argue why the person should not become a saint. And they go through a very rigorous process, and they interview tons of people And in the case of St. Joseph, there are estimates of thousands of people, both the congregants of the churches where he was at, and kings and princes and other nobility throughout Europe who had come to see him. And he passed the test. The devil's advocate was not able to argue that these stories weren't real, or that what thousands of people were seeing over a period of 30 years was not true. So they concluded, yeah, he was doing things that were really remarkable. And he was very lucky that he was a priest, because if he was not a priest and doing what he did, he probably would have been killed by the Inquisition, because witch hunting was a favorite sport back then.
Sure.
And anyone who showed these kinds of powers that was not within the bounds of the church would have been executed. So the second example is a physical medium called Daniel Douglas Hume, who was one of the most famous mediums. A physical medium means that rather than just simply getting information mentally, they were able to make things happen in the world. They can make tables tipping, and in particular, the most interesting thing about Hume is that he was able to levitate, just like St. Joseph. And unlike St. Joseph, by the time that Hume came around in the 1800s, there were many newspapers that were reporting his feats, because he did thousands of seances, again, from ordinary people up to kings and princes. And in particular, science had already started then, and there were many scientists who evaluated him, and as well, many stage magicians, most of whom were convinced that he was completely fake. But as I point out in the book, that one of the best biographies of Hume was written by a magician, a stage magician. And he concluded that over many years, many decades of doing his seances, no one was ever able to show that Hume was cheating, including all of the stage magicians of the day, including the best ones of the day. He was able to do remarkable things, and no one could figure out how. So that doesn't tell us that it was necessarily that he was doing magic, but whatever it was something that no one had ever seen before and couldn't explain. So my guess is, yeah, some of it was probably real. The third person is named Ted Owens, and he died in the 1980s, but there's still people in living memory who worked with him and were able to document things that he did. So one of his specialties was pointing and having a lightning bolt hit where he pointed, or even more dramatically, predicting in advance, not only predicting, but saying that he was going to make UFOs appear that would be seen above a large city, and it would be associated with weird effects in the atmosphere, and somebody would see an actual alien. So he made all of these predictions in advance about when and where, and it would come true. So like in one particular case over San Francisco Bay, sure enough, somebody had filmed it. It was in a newspaper, and somebody encountered, completely unexpectedly, something that they considered to be an alien, all reported in the newspaper. So that's one example of many examples where Ted Owens had made predictions and made things happen, apparently. So here are cases separated by hundreds of years of a couple of individuals who would fit into the class of the fictional Merlin, able to do really monstrous things. And that partially answers the question then of, well, why should I care? Well, you should care because at least at the high end of talent, these things are not simply small effects that we see in a laboratory, but they're really pushing the world around to a large extent.
Very, very interesting indeed. It strikes me that, and this is, as so many things are, maybe an overgeneralization, but you've got two camps. You've got the camp of the true believers who, and they'll say, oh, those scientists, we don't want anything to do with them. They're a bunch of, and I hate to use the phrase, but eggheads, which I think is a ridiculous stance. And then you've got the hardcore debunker, maybe someone who considers them to be a scientist, who says, "Oh, these people, they're woo woo. It makes no sense. It's just a bunch of bunk, and I'm not even going to waste my time looking into these things because there's nothing to it." Now, do you think, assuming that that's a fair assumption for a good percentage of people on each side of the fence, do you think there's room and a movement toward a meeting of the minds where we can be logical and interested in research, but also interested in these supposed magical happenings?
Well, for people who don't have much trust in science, I would have to say that if you just look at the statistics on things like expected longevity, because of science, in particular medical science, we live about twice as long as about 3 generations ago. So the average person can live to be 70 or 80, but it used to be 30 or 40. So do we want to believe in the science or not? By the same token, most people carry around a cell phone or a smartphone. Most people have no idea how it works. So it might as well be magic to them. But it does work. Well, all of this is based on science. So for someone to simply blithely dismiss science as they don't believe it or they don't want to pay attention to it, that's just crazy.
And I agree, by the way. I often make the point that the fact that we're talking right now and that you have a program that you can have, we could do our interview now and I could release it within a half hour, could be available to virtually everyone on the planet, or at least everyone has internet access. That is nearly a miracle to me.
Yeah. And
Thanks
most
to
people
science.
It requires maybe 20 years of education to figure out how would you build it from scratch? Like, how would you know everything in enough detail to be able to build these kinds of things? Well, it's not easy, but obviously there's a lot of people who know how to do it. So we are slowly taking what used to be a magical way of thinking about everything and figuring it out. And the figuring out turns into technologies, and we have much better lives as a result. On the other side, you have skeptics who imagine that they already understand how the world works. Maybe they've been a little bit too enthralled with science and have adopted what's called a scientistic or scientism perspective, which elevates science into a kind of religion, but a peculiar kind of religion because they only accept what is currently understood and don't know enough about.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because the phrase that I hate to hear a lot of times is it's settled science. Well, again, I am not a scientist, and I defer to most in knowledge of science. But to me, I thought that science was supposed to evolve and take into account new information. I didn't think that it was a static thing that stayed in one place.
No, you're completely right. Science, the big difference between science and religion is that religion gives you an absolute way of thinking about things, and it does not change. That's what dogma is all about. Science is explicitly against dogma. It evolves as we learn new things. And when you come down to the really basic fundamentals, there are a lot of things, in fact, most things, that we really don't understand at all. If we understood medicine and the human body better, then why are people still getting cancer? And why there are all kinds of problems that we don't know how to solve, and billions of dollars are being spent to try to figure it out. And this is true at the cutting edge of every single scientific discipline. There are many, many things. In fact, it's often been said that the more you know about something, the more you realize how much there is more to learn. Or said in another way, let me get this right. It's as the bonfires of knowledge grow brighter, the more the darkness is revealed to our startled eyes. I like that as a poetic way of saying that you finally get a glimmer of understanding about something, and the moment that happens, you realize how much bigger the problem is. We're really extremely ignorant. Science is only a couple hundred years old. And in the process of developing science, I think we have forgotten, or we've shoved aside, certain kinds of ideas that you see in the esoteric traditions where they were completely correct. This was they didn't have scientific terms for what they were talking about because it was prior to science. But to simply dismiss 10,000 years of received wisdom as wrong is just about as stupid as just not believing anything about science. So I believe you're right, that there are extremes in terms of people not paying any attention, people assuming that science is fixed. The truth is that real scientists are paying attention to a kind of dynamic way of thinking about who we are, how does consciousness work, why are we here, does the universe have purpose, all of these big questions. And as evidence of that, when I wrote Real Magic, I could have asked my buddies who are into human potential movements and affirmations and that sort of thing, I could have asked them for endorsements, but I decided not to. And I went instead to my science buddies. And so the book, Real Magic, has been endorsed by 2 Nobel laureate scientists, by the president of the American Statistical Association, which is the branch of science that evaluates data, by a former program director at the National Science Foundation, major award winners from the National Institutes of Health and the National Academy of Sciences, and on and on and on and on. So mainstream, very prominent scientists have looked at my book on Real Magic and said, holy smoke, this is something I'd be willing to endorse, which they did. So this is, from my perspective and from theirs, this is where the excitement of science is. It's saying that, well, maybe we don't understand these ancient ideas about magic or even psychic phenomena, but the evidence is there. That means it provides a puzzle, which for most open-minded scientists becomes an extremely attractive puzzle to try to figure out. And of course, there are lots of other pragmatic consequences eventually as we figure it out. And it's part of my long-term interest in seeing what has been known for a long period of time, 10,000 years or more, and trying to pull out of that what seems to make sense and what doesn't. Because science is really good at some things, but it also has blinders. So we have to sometimes look outside the box to find things that are actually useful to know, and then incorporate the box by making it bigger to accommodate those new things. And so the new things here are psychic phenomena and magic.
Well, it is a fascinating discussion, fascinating book, Real Magic, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science, and a Guide to the Secret Power of the Universe, and just a great perspective and great information. Dr. Radin, where can people find the book, and where can they find everything that you do and keep up to date on your work?
Well, for me, deanradin.org will bring you to a website that talks about my books and magics and all the events I'm doing, that sort of thing. So deanradin.org. Where I work is the Institute of Noetic Sciences. That's noetic.org. And Real Magic can be purchased wherever books are sold in ebook form or paperback or audiobook. So the audiobook is doing particularly well. It's the bestseller for ESP and parapsychology on Amazon. Currently has 87 reviews on Amazon with a 5-star average. And the real book, the Real Magic audiobook, was read by the same voice artist that has read most of the Dan Brown books.
Oh, good choice.
Yeah, he's the kind of guy who can read the phone book and it would just be a fascinating read.
Very good. Well, our guest has been Dr. Dean Radin. The book is Real Magic, Ancient Wisdom, Modern Science, and a Guide to the Secret Power of the Universe. Dr. Radin, thank you for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that program as much as I did. Dr. Radin, I love the idea of a real scientist talking about real magic. And finally, if you were thinking, hey, Jim, I notice you have about a dozen free episodes of the Paranormal Podcast or Campfire for free at any given time, but how in the heck do I access these hundreds of other episodes that you've done before, going all the way back to 2005? Well, my friend, it's very easy. All you have to do is go over to jimharoldplus.com. That's jimharoldplus.com. We've got a big sale going on over there, and you could get your first month for only $2.95. You sign up, click on the banner and sign up to become a member, and you can get access to a whole treasure trove of shows. You can listen on our Jim Harold Spooky Studio app. You can also listen on our Plus Club websites. What comes with it? 300 plus campfire episodes, 500 plus paranormal podcasts, no longer on the free feed, plus hundreds of more shows that I've done have never been free and that you wouldn't have access to unless you are a member of the Plus Club. Now, I think you should check it out, but of course I'm biased, but humor me. Go to JimHaroldPlus.com. That's JimHaroldPlus.com. That great sale we've got going on, and it really helps power our shows. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next time on the Paranormal Podcast. Bye-bye. Now for the legal disclaimer. We do not accept money from publishers or content producers in exchange for interviews. However, as with most media outlets, in the majority of cases, we do receive complimentary copies of books and DVDs that we feature on our podcasts. Your purchases of books, DVDs, and other items via our Amazon.com links benefit Jim Harold and JimHarold.com and help us continue our programming. The sponsor messages you hear on the programs are paid endorsements, although we really do like them. For the full disclaimer, go to JimHarold.com, and thanks for listening.